Welcome to Moral Footprint, the podcast where we unlearn, rethink, and take action. I'm your host, Jeni Miles, and together we'll challenge the systems we've inherited, confront the crises of our time, and explore the strategies that help us move from awareness into meaningful change. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Lorraine Smith, a pioneering voice in sustainable business who was in the mainstream ESG space for 20 years. I first discovered Lorraine's work through her groundbreaking materiality framework, a bold rethinking of traditional corporate materiality, but bringing the actual word reality into it. Materiality assessments typically focus on what's most materially critical to a company, but Lorraine's version of materiality flips the lens outward, centering what's truly critical in service of life, not profit. Her Google case study, which I encountered while working there, starkly contrasted the company's stated purpose of universal information access with the practical reality that most of its revenue comes from ads, dominated by clients driving consumptions of goods. In our conversation, we'll unpack why traditional ESG frameworks obsess over metrics instead of questioning fundamentally unsustainable business models. We also discuss how her open source framework helps pinpoint these disconnects and her 3-level approach to meaningful individual action. Join us as we cut through the corporate sustainability noise and explore what it really takes for businesses to shift from extraction to regeneration. Welcome to the podcast. Thank you for being with me today.
Thanks, Jeni. Great to be here. Really appreciate the invite.
I really wanted to chat to you in particular because I feel like your work cuts through the crap of big business greenwashing, and it also not just calls out the problems, but says this is what I think businesses should be doing. You've actually been in sustainability long before many of us even started to wake up to the scale of the problems we face. So with that in mind, I'd love it if you can start by just sharing your journey in mainstream corporate sustainability and then why you decided to leave it.
Sure, thank you. Sometimes I feel a little long in the tooth around sustainability. I first entered what we would call the field of sustainability in 2003. Full disclosure, I didn't really know it was a field and I didn't know I was wandering into it. So I came in a bit naive coming out of the financial services industry where I'd been working for a while, and something didn't feel right. Lots more I could say about that, but I went on a little wander after that. I just sort of walked away from wonderful bosses and a great team and certainly some fairly golden handcuffs going, I don't feel good about this, but I'm not sure what to do instead. I went on a spinning and knitting journey as an artisan, which I've been most of my life, just meeting with spinners, knitters, weavers across Canada, where I'm from, to kind of collect my thoughts. And when I got back to my, at the time, hometown of Toronto, I needed to get back to work and earn a living and all that good stuff. And a dear friend that I used to work with at World Wildlife Fund asked me if I was ready to get back to work, had I run out of money yet, etc. And indeed, I was ready. And she said, I think this organization might be more your cup of tea. And it was Canadian Business for Social Responsibility, which was in its early days of working with large corporations instead of the small, medium, sort of mom and pop shops. And frankly, you could just fast forward 20 years and come to 2021, where I proceeded for a couple decades to do what we now call corporate sustainability or ESG strategy, investor engagement, executive engagement, external stakeholder engagement, reporting and disclosure, kind of mainstream.
A lot of data.
Work. Yeah, a lot of data, a lot of conversations, a lot of research. So that's a real kind of whirlwind through the journey. But I feel like I sort of grew up in the industry as the industry was being born. It took me a few years to really realize that that's what was going on. Mm-hmm. And then I stepped out of it in 2021, which is around the time you and I were first connecting. Yeah. Should I say a bit about why I left? I think that was embedded in the question.
Yeah, exactly. Was there a particular moment? Because there's parallels with when you were in financial services and you're like, something doesn't feel good. There's some kind of cognitive dissonance, or I don't feel truly aligned and I want to go, but I can't put my finger on it.
Yeah. And, it's funny with time, things change shape a little, right? Hindsight, we can see things more clearly. But I'm even realizing now, so we're having this conversation in early 2025, and I really made the sort of final leap out of mainstream sustainability in October 2021. And it's only kind of now that I see the real parallels. So thank you for noticing and asking. And let me just sharpen what I mean by that. I left my job in financial services, even though I said all those nice things and I mean them about the people I worked with. And it was really interesting work. Like, I enjoyed a lot of it. But my role in particular at that time was in a group, it was in group pensions, which basically means retirement savings. In particular, although it was Canadian headquarters that I was in, the business unit we worked in is in what's called U.S. group pensions, which any American listeners will recognize as essentially the 401k market. And it was booming. I mean, this was the cash cow of the business, although it was still is a Canadian company. The majority of their revenue was really coming from the 401k market. So a very big part of the business, quite an exciting time. And there's much I could say about what my role was, but I just remember in particular this one meeting where we were talking about how to incentivize more investment. So get more employees to put more money aside month after month. And the way that it was happening, and this is essentially a marketing meeting, was to show them images of their retirement. And of course, how wealthy they'll be in retirement and all the kind of cliche.
They'll be on a yacht and they'll have lots of expensive food and
exactly. Holding their grandchild's hand on the beach, reading a book in the hammock, playing golf. And I was, at the time, I was in my early 30s then. So, young enough to be looking way out towards retirement, but old enough to have acquired some questions in my life. And so I said, why don't we also give investors and employees setting their money aside some perspective on what the money's doing for all those years? I might as well have said, why don't we all get on the table and dance naked right now? Like, it was such an absurd thing that I had said. I could tell by people's body language. I just tripped a wire, set off alarms.
Yeah, they're like, what do you mean by transparency? We don't do that.
And I didn't even know what I was asking. I was naively
you were just using common sense.
Yeah, because we would say over and over to these young investors, time is on your side. Compound interest, the magic of compound interest, and year after year, month after month, putting this money aside. But the only thing we talked about was how rich you'll be in retirement. So clearly something didn't align there. And I saw it around the table, fairly senior people looking at me like, why wouldn't we talk about, we're not breaking laws. We're following our fiduciary responsibility enough. Yeah. So that didn't feel good. That's a big part of why I walked away without even knowing what I was asking. Quite honestly, I'd never heard the term ESG. I believe in the fund lineup back then. So again, this is 2003 when I left. There were a couple really avant-garde funds in the fund lineup that would talk about what we would now call ESG or ethical investing. But I think there were 2 among hundreds, and they were tiny and not promoted. And it was sort of like, if you want some weird stuff, you could also get, a China-only investment if you want. It, in the land of weird things you could do, that's what you could do. So that didn't feel right. That's why I left. Why do I compare it to what happened in October 2021? Because I found myself asking, again, what I think are kind of basic questions through my sustainability years. Things like, why are we doubling down on this particular corporate strategy on, let's say, climate or human rights or responsible sourcing when we haven't seen it working? And actually things are getting worse. What about what's not working do we think we're changing by doing more of the thing that's not working? I wasn't asking it even that clearly now, but I was kind of bumping into that, wait a minute, we're causing the problems here at this company that we're pretending to be solving the problems with. Why aren't we talking about the fact that we're causing the problem instead of pretending that we're solving it? And over, I would find myself, and by the way, I was learning this from others. I was very slow to the party. I feel like I was a cheerleader. I was like, this is amazing. I remember when the SDGs were kind of rolling up in 2015, thinking oh, this is so good. It's so interconnected. It's so global,
Yeah, whereas now the common line is SDG is not expansive enough and it's reducing everything to metrics. And
exactly.
That leads me to the question around what you were saying, that we're doing the same things, but things aren't actually getting better, things are getting worse. And from what I've read from some of your work, it feels like a lot of the focus in the ESG or CSR world is about reporting, isn't it? It's about data. It's not necessarily about questioning the core business model and its actual unsustainability. That's not really on the table. Would you agree?
I would agree. It's a funny thing because I'm in this right now, so I won't pretend I have oh, Jeni, and now that we understand, here's the full answer and it's all very clear. But there are a couple things that are much more clear to me now that I wasn't getting, other than something's not quite right, so I'm just going to stop, which is what I did. One is that when you notice that the business model's not on the table and you call it up, hey, I think we need to talk about the business model here, not just the problems that are being caused and maybe that we're trying to address. genuinely with resources, with probably mostly good intentions. So when you bring that up, there's sort of three possible things that happen that I saw, or I could bucket them. Thing one is like, yeah, we can't really go there right now. Like just kind of whoosh, done.
It's like, it's too complex. Yeah. Let's go back to the easy stuff.
Or not even that much of an answer. Just kind of like, that's not what we're doing right now. Done. End of conversation. The second version is a little more rewarding, but only a little, which is like, that's true. And these are systemic issues and we know we're part of it. It'll be sort of like, these things are so systemic. It's so hard to get at, but this is at the least we need to meet the investor requirement for disclosure. And, so there's this kind of like, I would even say in that bucket, I literally have seen doing old school ESG materiality assessments where the business model is one of the issues on the assessment. It's rare, but it would be captured as like, this is an issue. And it's like, wait, what? So that's category 2. Category 3 is where I'd like to see us going more, but it's a very wide open space, which is where you get, our business model is really vested in the problem. In fact, it's only possible because of these problems.
Yeah.
And when you have candid conversations with folks who know that or sense it or aware, it gets very dark very quickly. Because if it were as simple as like, what we'll do? We'll just change our business model this quarter. It would
just take one quarter, exactly, and we'll just go following the same OKRs as before. Oh, wait, the OKRs will completely change.
Exactly. And
everything we're aiming for will completely change. Everything will shift. Our partners, our suppliers, everything could shift.
Exactly. That's, first of all, not in the remit of most of the folks responsible for sustainability strategy, even if they have a so-called executive role, even if they report directly to the board. In fact, I don't believe it's the CEO's role. I don't think it's the role of the company to put itself out of business.
Well, I also wonder whether it's because any other type of business model that's not for profit. So let's say with Jennifer Hinton's work, there's not for profit where you can still make money, but you're mission led, you're purpose led. Yeah. But what I'm noticing is not many people even know that there are other legal structures you can use.
That's
right.
But
at the same time, changing a legal structure of a huge multinational corporation, it feels like that is the only way to systemically kind of shift big business to address a core unsustainable business model. Because if we get to the root cause, it's really about extracting value, extracting profit above all else, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I wish I had this really fun answer, but I'm going to give what I'm seeing in response to that using a couple live examples. For sure, there are other governance models. Jurisdictionally, there are differences. So different countries will have different ways. But most countries that I'm aware of, a co-op is an option, worker-owned co-ops, different arrangements where the financial flows aren't necessarily just aggregating to absentee investors, for example. Marjorie Kelly does some amazing writing on that. She has a couple books. One goes into detail of real examples. I always mix up the title with Jared Lanier, who has a whole other amazing thread. It's Owning Our Future. Both excellent books, but one about corporate ownership structure, the other about essentially surveillance capitalism, which is another fun topic. Let me share what I'm observing with those companies who have gone that route, because there are many, right? And there are many
some that actually have pivoted.
Well, or are trying. Yeah. So I'm going to name 2 failure stories of that ilk, and I'm always on the lookout for success stories. Marjorie Kelly does share a few of them in that book, and I think there's great potential, but I'll end with the caution. So the failure stories, I just heard the other day that Dr. Bronner's, which is a consumer products company that had been B Corp certified, and I love those guys. I mean, I don't use a lot of products that come in bottles, but if I was gonna, I'd say, and I lived in a city where my best bet was to go to a shop like that and get that kind of product. Yeah. I really respect what they're doing. I really respect the noises they've made about regenerative agriculture, about really getting serious about their supply chain. And they just backed away from B Corp certification. So that's an interesting signal, because it's not that B Corp said, you guys don't meet our standard. They said to B Corp, you don't meet our standard.
Well, exactly, because B Corp still allow you to be just existing to drive profit, rather than
100%.
having any purpose. Yeah.
It, to me, beautifully encapsulates the very serious problem with mainstream ESG and sustainability.
Yeah.
And so that Dr. Bronner's had to say, look, we can't be with you because of this problem. I don't think they've fully solved the regenerative corporation problem either. And I'll get to why they haven't in a sec. But I found that to be a very interesting signal around, we talk about these models, these frameworks, and we got to be really eyes wide open with this. So another example I see so any Canadian listeners will know very well and probably loved and maybe doesn't love anymore, the company that was formerly known as Mountain Equipment Co-op, or MEC or MEC. It was a co-op and had been from the beginning. It began as a cooperative in all the ways that you hear of histories of cooperatives, usually people cooperating and then formalizing and organizing and monetizing to a degree. And what they were was outdoor sporting gear, equipment, etc. And it's an iconic brand in this country. Sometime within the last few years, they ended the co-op and became a corporation. And so the name changed from Mountain Equipment Co-op to Mountain Equipment Company. And I've heard recently that something is going on. I don't know if they're folding or something's changing. But I'll tell you, having known a little bit about the company backstage when it was a co-op, one of the challenges it had, and so I put a little pin in, I'll explain the concern that Bronner's will have and any others will, and this is what I think bit MEC, they still have to operate on planet Earth, where customers either don't know or don't understand or don't care what your governance structure is. They just want new boots, right? And what I saw happening was the origins of the model being very beautiful and regenerative and cooperative and collaborative, having to jam itself into a very degenerative model. And so in name, it was a cooperative, but in practice, it had to source and sell in the same retail model, which is profit-driven, has to manage inventory, supply, floor staff, all the things. So as long as the wider water you're swimming in is dirty, no matter how much you clean off your gills as a fish swimming in those waters, you are stinky. And so we have to figure out a way to clean the water.
Wow. There's a lot of businesses who, even though they try to do good, have to rely on some form of externalizing waste or using materials that might not be best for the planet. They could also be exploiting workers across the world. That's how business is done. So what you're saying is, even if you change the incorporation structure, it has to almost flow through everything you do. And the goal would be, if a company was in service of life, it wouldn't cause those externalities in the first place. But unfortunately, that's just how business is. Yeah.
And let me just make it worse for a minute, and then we'll work on making it better.
And then we'll talk about the solution.
Yeah. Spoiler alert, it's a complicated solution too. But let me highlight something that comes up a lot. This challenge begs a very simple question, which is, well, what do we do about it? And if you're in a senior industry role where you do have influence and appetite for real change, and you're genuinely committed, you maybe have kids or grandkids, or you just really care, you really get it, then what almost always comes up, which I'm learning to recognize and halt in its tracks, is, okay, so how do we fix our business model? And that's a paraphrasing of, how do we keep almost everything the same, but change this one variable, which we're going to call our business model? It's a little bit like saying, just to take it at a human analogy level, saying I'll imagine I'm super unhealthy. I'm 150 pounds overweight. I eat a terrible high sugar, high processed diet. I get zero exercise. And not surprisingly, my health is failing. And I consult a functional nutritionist who says, hey, heads up, we're looking at some changes here in order for you to be well. And I say, okay, yeah, I'm really keen to feel well because I don't feel so good right now. So how can I keep everything the same?
In terms of the diet, you mean?
Yeah. How can I change very little, but get healthy? And the answer is, you can't. Your entire diet is a toxic disaster for your metabolism. So you're talking about radically altering pretty much everything you eat, your entire relationship with food, most likely, which the knock-on effect there is your relationship with how you move, probably your personal relationships, who you're hanging out with, what you're doing when you spend time with them. And, this isn't like, how can we keep everything? This isn't just a tweak, just
Yeah.
have 3 tablespoons less of sugar on your porridge in the morning. It's like, stop eating grains, stop eating sugar. And then, now you have to go to different places to get your food. You have to understand how to perceive what food is in a different way. We need to break out of a model that says, I'm going to keep my business the same, but I'm just going to adapt a few things in it.
If we think about the fact that in the world that we live in, every business is going to have externalities no matter what, then surely it's really a question of which businesses should and shouldn't exist, given the planetary limits that we are living under. Do you see what I mean?
I do, yeah.
That might be one of the ways that we can move forward, because they need to exist. And the businesses that are just serving superfluous needs, we have to find a way to scale those down. It's essentially the degrowth argument.
Yeah, that resonates. I might use different language to get there. And let me just explain a bit why. And then, like, if I were queen of the universe, what would I be doing about this? First of all, I'd like to respectfully disagree with the idea that there will always be externalities. And I'll offer an alternative way of perceiving that. There will always be externalities if we always think of business the way we think of it now. But if we set aside a couple hundred years of industrial practice and ask ourselves what the economy does, it meets our needs and wants. It's our housekeeping, right? Literally, with the root of the word, it's all about kind of looking after our home. And there's lots of ways of looking after our home. We did it in lots of ways pre-industrially. And even if we go pre-agriculture, you have lots of different ways. And I'm not proposing we go back to hunter-gatherer or that we drop all technology that we have. And I want to be really clear about that. But I am reminding us that we have lots of different ways to meet our wants and needs that may or may not involve exchange. So wiping the slate clean of the current industrial model and not assuming corporate bodies the way they exist now gives us permission.
Well, they have rights as much as humans.
Yeah, exactly, or more.
Yeah.
And that gives us the opportunity to set aside the word externality. And why I want to set it aside is because I prefer remembering that we're all in relation all the time to everything, everywhere, across time and space, at all levels and all scales, which is a little mind-boggling, but it just happens to be true. Like, we're all made of stardust, whether we like it or not. So there we are. So the idea of an externality, to me, is it's so baked in to the thing we never should have baked. And so if we're going to let go of that thing, then we're going to let go of this notion of externalities, and we're going to shift. And I think many people have shifted. I think we're naturally born this way, and then we get kind of reoriented. We're going to remember that we're all in relation. And then the question is how to be in right relation, how to show up as a steward of life, how to recognize needs and wants in ways that involve reciprocity and involve perhaps exchange, perhaps harm, right? I mean, you go out into the forest and you spend a bit of time, you see some creatures are on the short end of the stick, right? They don't live long, they get eaten, they die, they get diseases. So it's not everybody thriving all the time on everything, but it's more of a relational, reciprocal mode where the emphasis is on meeting needs and wants in ways that restore wellness versus hoard wealth. Does that make sense?
I think, yes, that completely makes sense. I think that's probably a good segue to how you have gone beyond the corporate standard of materiality to your version of bringing reality into it with your materiality assessment. Because what you're doing there is actually acknowledging there are some systemic ways that certain companies are either hoarding power or there's information asymmetry. And I should highlight at this point that I came across your Google materiality assessment while I was still working there. And I was already beginning to question what I saw was a huge disconnect between what big business prioritizes and what we need to do and what we can do as a sort of global system, because we are in a closed system at a planetary level. We can't keep having some corporations overstep the mark and have too much power. And what I love about your materiality work is you shine a light on the gap between what the corporations say their purpose is and what they actually make their money from.
Sure. And I think that'll lead us towards so what do we do about it? Which is a fun place to play. Thank you for finding my work and for commenting. It was really neat to hear from you being at Google. It was like, oh my gosh, you can hear me. And I recognize some of what I'm going to say is a bit naive. And if that gives you the ticket to dismiss what I say, I'm okay with that. I get that. But I also know that there's power in this naivete because it's very simple.
And it's factual. It's based in the truth.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, of course, we might argue there's like multiple truths, but I do all in my humble power to base things not only in facts that I think are hard to refute, but actually they're in facts signed off by the company's own legal counsel. And having done a lot of mainstream corporate sustainability work, boy, did I have to go through some hoops with legal counsel. So I know they don't just sign off on things willy-nilly. They remove a lot of things. They change the words. They make sure that the risk is mitigated from all kinds of angles. So if legal counsel has signed off on stuff, disclosures and other communications elements of a given company, from my perspective, I think that's the best source of all. I think there's other sources, great journalists out there, interesting academic work. I'm glad it's out there and I respect it. But my main font for information about corporate activity is the company themselves. And I only draw on public disclosures, which means although I worked with over 100 companies over the years, mostly Fortune 500, global, cross-sectoral, I do my best to not do assessments on companies that I've gone backstage with, just to keep my process clean. So it really is disclosure that I just found because I'm a member of the public and I found it. So I began with Google here's the naive process that happened. After 20 years of doing mainstream sustainability work, including dozens of mainstream ESG materiality assessments, and let us recall that kind of assessment is designed to help the company identify its most so-called material issues, meaning they're most important to the company. They might affect the bottom line. They might affect some stakeholder group or other that will matter to the company. And the teams would be paid anywhere between, I saw the super cheap and cheerful would be like 25 grand. These are US dollars. The not so cheap and cheerful, some of these would run to be $250,000. These were big ticket consulting projects, depending on how much communication, how much web development, how much interactivity, how many stakeholders we interviewed, etc. So we'd be paid to be very busy, talking to lots of people, analyzing lots of information that the company would provide, and we would go find to figure out what are these companies' issues. And we'd be figuring out their issues are climate change, if they're a mining company, human rights, conflict minerals, if they're a food and ag company, access to nutrition, pesticide use. Basically, you and I could spend 10 minutes and brainstorm and come up with the materiality assessment for any company in the world because they're really
without having to
well-known
spend
issues
all that time interviewing all those people. It's like almost so obvious.
Exactly. Not only is it obvious, but so I could see, I'm open to spending time on the obvious. Sometimes you learn new things, you go deeper, you put it to the front of your mind, like it's obvious we need more sleep, but we don't all do it. Where I have a little problem with this obvious exercise that's very expensive that kept a lot of people busy is it had no impact. Like we would talk year after year about the same issue. There were several companies for whom I played an embarrassingly important role in their disclosures where the same issue would be on the table year after year. And I'd be like, this is embarrassing to say. And I'm sorry, I love you if you were on a project team with me and you're hearing this. Like we had good times. We did good things as best we could. But I don't think you'll disagree with me. And if you do, just message me or message Jeni and correct us. There were many times where the report from the year before, the content on a given issue was a cut and paste. And then because we were paid to write, we would edit it to sound different. I mean...
Yeah, because nothing had ironically, nothing had materially changed
exactly.
year on year.
And I could say even darker things, but there's no point. You get the picture. Not that anybody was telling us to do anything illegal, but when you would connect the dots about the issues, you'd just be like, dudes, we're writing about horrifying things. And we're copying and pasting, and then we're tweaking and paraphrasing so that it's a so-called new round of disclosure. So that didn't work. That was a big part of why I stepped all the way away in 2021 and gently fired all 7 of my clients to say, like, I really do love you. And I
Stop
love
paying me money.
But this is just nuts. So my naive change to the process, along with spelling, and it came about very honestly, I was kind of ranting with one of my long-term clients in the banking sector saying, with love, we got to stop doing these materiality assessments. And we got to talk about reality. Like we got to put reality into materiality.
Literally into materiality.
Yeah, and she was like, it's kind of like you're just spelling it differently. And I was like, yeah, come to think of it.
You're like,
and
I need
she
to leave.
genuinely asked me, well, how would you do it differently? And we took a run at doing it differently inside that bank. And I realized they can't handle it, any shift. So I stepped away, and here's what different looks like. Instead of the mainstream approach of we're going to look at what issues are important for this company. We're going to organize them in a list or a matrix or some kind of report. We're going to say a bunch of things about those issues and make it public. Maybe talk to our investors about them, show how we're reducing risk or optimizing opportunities. No, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to center the company. I'm going to center life. And what I mean by that is
the people impacted, basically.
People, ecological systems.
Yeah.
So I'm going to, and of course, I have a perspective on life, but I don't know everything. And I want to understand wider perspectives. So I'm going to ask a range of stakeholders. If I'm going to interview stakeholders for an assessment, I'm going to ask people who have a perspective about human, societal, ecological wellness and this company's behavior in relation to it. So that the thing to keep constant isn't that the company will, of course, forever thrive, but rather that we would like life to thrive. And this company may be undermining it currently, or maybe contributing to it, maybe a mix of both. What do we think? And not just what do we think, what do you think, what do I think, what do people we can ask this question think? What does the more than human world think? And of course, I can't really speak for migratory birds. I can't really speak for Georgian Bay or the St. Lawrence River, but I can sit with questions about what might be beneficial for the perspective of the river or the birds or the trees. I can sit with those questions for a lot longer than just sort of consulting a professor of biology. To be crystal clear, what we did with materiality and what I believe is still done, this is like the process. You ask stakeholders, what do you think the most important issues are for this company? And maybe you say why, and maybe you say, tell me more about that issue. But you don't say, is this company actually enabling life to thrive, or is it undermining it? And I can also say with some honesty, for the dozens that I was involved in, we did not ask people who had a very different point of view. We might have asked friendly critics, like they knew the industry, they had some critiques, but they were also funded by the industry, had good reason to stay in good.
They were likely to say the right things in a way. Nothing
they
to
might
ruffle some
critique.
feathers. Yes.
Right. There was no, like in the Google assessment, which is public, and anybody who'd like to see it, happy to have you include that in the show notes if it feels appropriate.
Yeah, sure.
People can watch the stakeholder interviews, and they vary, by the way. I ask outright, how do you believe this company is contributing to or undermining life? And some folks said all kinds of great things about Google, because Google does all kinds of great things. But some said it shouldn't exist. It should just end and dissolve. And the degree of harm it causes is immeasurable, both to society and ecology. And those folks probably wouldn't be engaged in a mainstream corporate ESG assessment. So yeah, what I would do is ask, what does the company say it does? And in Google's case, the purpose is quite clearly stated, to make all the world's data accessible to everyone, everywhere, something like that. But when I looked at the financial data, which they make accessible, it's all right under our noses. At the time, I think I was looking at 2022 data, might have been 2021. The revenue was 251 billion US, I think, that year. While many people were losing their jobs, losing their lives, losing their shirts, Google's profits were going up, up, up. And over 80%, I think it was, came from advertising revenue. So the way I tested for that, just, checking in with random folks. So quick question. Do you think making the world's data accessible to everyone all the time is the same as selling advertising? I'm just checking. Are those the same thing? They're not mutually exclusive, obviously, but they're not the same. Let's not pretend. So then looking at the gap and saying stated purpose, actual purpose, then asking, well, what would need to be true in order for this company to truly serve life? What does that look like?
Yeah, I think you came up with, if it did have a life-affirming mission, what would it be? And I'm pretty sure you said it's where Google creates a healthy commons, practices data symmetry, and incentivizes the wellness of all living systems. And that's essentially a company like Google being in service of life. For a lot of the assessments I'm looking at that you've done, one of the big themes is that these companies are making money from driving overconsumption, which cannot continue. With the materiality assessments, have you had any interest from any particular businesses about how they might use your open source framework to start to realize, oh, this is how I should be thinking about other stakeholders. This is how I should be assessing the way that my business serves life or not?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I have a multi-level answer to it. Because again, I'm aware that there's a risk that naivete shows up as solutions versus just different ways of coming at things. So I just want to be really honest about my expectation of how much people can do with this different kind of approach. And so I think of it in terms of levels. And my level 1, I feel like anybody who wants this can have this. And what's that? That is just a more clear-eyed look at a company's business model, how it genuinely earns revenue, like where the money comes from, but what its actual purpose is. And not in a tear down way, not in a this is really bad way, just in a way better understanding way. Because I can tell you, like, and I hope some of your listeners are engaged in some way in mainstream sustainability, and that this offers them a chance to do things a little differently. Because, for example, when we did our materiality assessments back in the day, it was seen as really kind of edgy to listen to the company's investor earnings calls, to look at previous years of investor calls or earnings decks, or even just to go into annual reports and look at their financials. I remember feeling like I kind of had to do it on the side a little bit. Like, we're hearing about this and that with human rights and sustainable this and ethical that. And I'd be like, well, hang on. I just noticed in your, financial disclosures, which seem to be totally on another track. We wouldn't even talk with the people.
So there was like that huge chasm between the two.
Exactly. And so this seems so basic, but I am sorry to tell you, Jeni, that it is not basic. Like, it wasn't even part of the training of doing this work. So if this became basic, level 1 would be already a different game, which is when you're creating those disclosures for the company, when you're looking at communicating or engaging or doing any of the things that sustainability and ESG folks do, or if you're an investor looking at this stuff, you lead with the real financial generation stuff. Yeah. What does it mean? Like, how many billions are being made doing what? And that'll help with a really basic thing, like Scott's Miracle-Gro, for example. It's like a warm and fuzzy gardening products company. But when you look them up on Seeking Alpha, for example, which is like an investor dashboard, not because I'm investing, but because I like to see who's saying what among
You want to see the disconnect between what they say and what they do, don't you?
Yeah. So Scott's Miracle-Gro, which honestly, it's like a warm and fuzzy brand. Like, my grandmother had Scott's Miracle-Gro products all over her home. It is listed in the fertilizer and chemical industry sector. It's because it is an agribusiness sector. It is the only seller of Roundup, also known as glyphosate, in North America for the non-agribiz markets. It essentially sells pesticides held together with other media like peat, which is a biodiversity disaster.
With the emissions, exactly, yeah.
Right. So when you look at their branding, their purpose is to grow more good. They changed the spelling of grow. I can't give them too much trouble for that because I changed the spelling of materiality. But, it looks like they're all about let's garden, let's have kids planting carrots and all kinds of wonderful things. But when you look at how they make money, they sell controls, which are pesticides.
Which is killing life.
It is killing life. Yes. And one of their growth areas, and now they've had a lot of volatility. I don't know if they've divested, but they were growing their commercial cannabis business. And I'm kind of neutral on pot smoking. This isn't about like do get high, don't get high, but it's more like, come on, let's be honest about what you're doing. You're leveraging a growing industry that is frankly about life, like people numbing out because it's all a little bit too much. If you were serious about plant medicines, we could have another conversation. So level 1, if you just look at the financial data and the signals that the CEO and CFO give to investors, which is public, and publicly listed companies, you can see what they're really doing. And you have a very different view than what you're guided to be viewing as sustainability professional.
Yeah, it's almost like branding versus the actual reason for the company to exist and how it actually makes money.
That's right. And something very clear happens with level 1, by the way. It happened with Google, it happens with Scott's Miracle-Gro, another company I did a deep dive on it, and many others, which is you realize that many of these companies are running on what I think of as branding fumes. So Google, it was 2 guys in a garage, right? Like, what a cool idea. This search engine, the story is just like the stuff of fairy tale. Scott's Miracle-Gro goes back to the 1800s and they have a really cool origin story. Okay, but that's not how they work now, right? Like, once upon a time, I was a toddler who couldn't put my own shoes on, but now I'm a 54-year-old grown-up woman. We change. And if we pretend that we're still stuck in that story, all kinds of dangerous gobbledygook swirls around. So it's like, yeah, don't hide your history, but don't pretend that that's your present.
Yeah.
And so that quickly clears away a lot of noise. Level 1, I think, is already a step in the right direction because it just helps us stay awake, not numb out, just stay present to reality, some really cool things that we find out are going on. Level 2 is kind of an expansion on that, which is like, okay, well, having this data and being tasked with whatever it is, communicating with investors, seeking out more, companies who are more innovative, more willing to be real about their impact on society and the environment, whatever it is, whatever your task is. Well, now you're armed with better questions, better information to be more clear-eyed about what's going on. So at the very least, you aren't going to be pretending to be investing in sustainable things that are actually not sustainable. You aren't going to be propagating the lies, the greenwashing, the problem. And you're going to be armed with far more intelligent questions that will have at least a better chance of a different outcome versus just kind of repurposing the past stuff.
It's almost like, interrogating the truth of that disconnect, isn't it? That's what materiality, in how you do it, how it brings it to life. Because I feel like so much of this is about corporate and cultural norms, and it's very easy to see how things can shift. Like, for example, with the Google assessment, you called out how the founders actually say, we're not sure if ads is conducive to having a fair and equitable search engine, and it should actually be safeguarded by academia. But then fast forward 20 years and so much has changed, and it's about just like calling a spade, isn't it, with materiality?
Yeah. Exactly. And I do believe there is a fair bit of power in that. It may simply be power for the individual doing the work, where it's sort of like, oh, I'm not crazy. It's sort of an end to the gaslighting. But there's power beyond that. If you're working with a really thoughtful executive team who genuinely wants their $250,000 materiality assessment to be useful, apply this lens. And by the way, this is a free open source methodology. You can have it. Like, anybody can have this and really do what they want with it. And imagine if those conversations were brought into the spaces where decisions are being made and genuine questions are being tossed around. Yeah. So I think that's a realistic expectation. Where things get much wider, and this is where naivete will take you so far, and then you got to go into sort of leap of faith, courage, dreaming. And by dreaming, I mean like really allowing your mind to hold different ideas, different ways.
To imagine other alternatives.
Alternatives, and it's so cliche, but I think it's cliche because it's true, that there are other paradigms. Like, we came from a different paradigm and we're headed towards another one. And so there really are different worldviews and sort of macro incentives and processes. So if we just accept, like, okay, some of this is really big and I might not be changing it like next Tuesday afternoon, but what are we really talking about here? Okay, that's level 3. And what that looks like to me, and I invite your listeners to have it look like something else to you all, because I'm just one person. But what that looks like to me is I recognize a very different possibility. So with Google, you named some of the characteristics that if Google said, oh, geez, we really want to serve life, we're going to run with what some of these stakeholders said and a bunch more. Really drop into listening. What's possible? It begs the question, well, what's mine to do with that? And there, I think I have 2 jobs, 2 very distinct jobs. Others will have other distinct jobs. Job 1 for me that I've accepted for now is to keep holding that vision that the economy really does serve life. And, what does that look like? And get as specific as possible, find as many living and breathing examples of that as possible. Keep lifting it up. It's like this. It's like this.
Yeah. And it doesn't have to be this way.
Yeah, exactly. And so really, well, what's the alternative? And keep listening for that. And that's what I pull up in those conversations with stakeholders. It's what I'm on the lookout for all the time. I'm always watching for examples, happy to share a few as they're coming up. That's one of my jobs. But the other job that feels a bit more kind of brass tacks day to day is pulling me and anyone who will come with me closer to that reality, making real changes in my day to day so that that's the economy I'm part of building, and not the one that I don't want. So that could be as simple as, where do I buy my food? As much as possible, I'm buying it from farmers I can look in the eye, who are part of restoring soils, bringing biodiversity back to the farmland, who, are asking really challenging questions in the face of industrial ag, but doing it anyway. That's a really concrete example of living my life, living my work life. It means doing what I'm doing now, looking at old tools and going, those ones didn't work so well. But I think some of them could be repurposed in service of life. And so I'm going to take one, retool it, put it out into the world and say, who would like to use this tool? So I want to make it very clear that level 3, because I see people spinning out and just getting like, oh, it's all so big, it's too much, I can't do it, I got kids in school, I'm paying my mortgage, I just want to retire, those are fair desires. It doesn't have to be everything all the time, everywhere now. It can just be what's yours to do.
It can start small, like you say. It doesn't have to be, like, for example, when I was at Google, there was no way I'd be able to convince the whole company, actually, why don't you have a life affirming mission? Like, there's no way one person could ever do that. And, I'm still on my own journey about what is mine to do. But what's really great about what you can offer is you have a ton of ways of working with professionals who sense there's a problem or that there's better ways of doing things. Whether it's workshops or calls, how could you help someone who listens to this and thinks, okay, I want to take action. How can Lorraine help me?
Wow. Well, thank you. There's a few ways. I spend a lot of time researching to create examples like the ones we've been talking about and just putting them out into the world so that people can have a data set, an example, a case study to look at and kind of test their own thinking and challenge and evolve their own thinking. So the number one way I think folks could engage with what I'm doing is to absorb some of that. Look at my blog, run with some of the data sets, dig a little deeper. There's also some premium content there to go deeper into some of the case studies that I talk about, but I try to make as much of it free and freely available as I can. So that's one way. I also do some one-on-one coaching with folks. So exactly as you characterize there, Jeni, I like how you put it, that people are sort of sensing something's not quite right. And really, they come to me to sense check and then to spar and bounce ideas because there's one very common characteristic with folks who come to me asking for help in a coaching or advisory capacity, which is they are not determined to keep everything the same, but try to change something. There's a recognition that while it's quite uncomfortable, I'm not sure what's next, things are changing. And they want to be part of changing in a way that has more meaning, more purpose aligned with this life-affirming economy. Yeah. And so I sort of walk alongside with usually folks who are in industry. So they're in some kind of corporate role and they're figuring out, first of all, are they crazy? No. And then second of all, well, what does it look like to go forward? It doesn't necessarily mean quit your job and run away and live in a cave, but it might mean
because also for me, like actually being able to quit a job if you're thinking there are other ways of living more truly to your values and what you think needs to happen, that's also a privilege, isn't it? Not everyone can do that. And so I'm also grappling with how to then make the most of that.
Yeah. And that's a great point. I agree. And I hear often a lot of people saying, well, I couldn't do that because, and to be very blunt and perhaps a bit ungenerous, often the because is an excuse. Like, no, you could. You might have reasons not to, and it's not for me to judge or decide. But that's very different than you can't. So one of the things, I think I offer two things in different formats, and they are permission and courage. Permission to realize, oh yeah, no, this is real. Things are happening. Very significant shifts are underway. They're big. Some of them are kind of dark. How do we do it? And then the courage courage is really coming from the word heart. And so how do you drop into your heart and move forward? I do indeed offer workshops where folks roll up their sleeves and create their own assessments. So they're like, okay, I kind of get it, but I'd like to make the time and space to do this. And this is really critical to the workshop and the advisory work, is to then get to, so what does this have to do with you? What are some next steps that mean something to you now? There's no right or wrong there. It doesn't have to be big or small. It's really for you to determine what's next on your path. And if I may, I want to just share the 3 framing questions that I ask with folks who are trying to make change of any sort, but specifically in this stuff. Because I hear a lot of kind of hand waving and desperation and like, oh my God, it's so big, it's everything. But there's ways to make it bite-sized and meaningful. I ask people to get really specific. What is it you seek to change? From what to what? And it's amazing how much power there is in just trying to get clear on that. It may change. I ask myself the question all the time. I'm ever evolving the scope, breadth, width, whatever of what I'm changing. But if I can't actually say from what to what, then I might just be in a kind of heightened state of anxiety versus really working on something useful. So what is it I seek to change from what to what? In my case, I'm looking to change that there are more people in the world who really believe the economy can and should serve life and that they have a role to play in that. And then I go digging a little deeper, but there aren't very many. There's going to be more. The second question is a very imaginative one, and we won't go too deep into it here, but I'll just ask it and invite your listeners to kind of pause and try this on. What does it feel like when the change is true? How are you when that change is true?
Mm.
And it's really important with this question to not be like, well, I think I'd probably not have to deal with all this really horrible stuff. It's like, okay, first of all, you're kind of thinking, you're not feeling. Second of all, you're thinking what it isn't.
Yeah. So it's like,
Exactly. Just drop into how are you when the change is true. I encourage people to really spend time. I practice this every Monday morning with a group of folks who join my practice change calls. I mean, almost without fail, there are tears, there are goosebumps. People, like when they really give themselves permission to try the change on in a kind of meditative feeling zone, it's very powerful. And so having felt that, having let your body just momentarily kind of vibrate into the place you want to be in, then the third question, you come back to the present. Well, it's not true right now. That's why I want to change it. Well, what's one thing you can do this week to make that change come true? And that's where the courage and permission comes in. That's where but I can't, okay, that's okay. Like, we're not here to judge. But if you're really into this, if you're like, no, that is my life. Well, what's one thing you can do this week to make that change come true? And be specific about, not like I might think about it more, or I'll add this into my journaling. No, I'm going to call my mentor and ask her to keep me honest about having 10 informational interviews, or, whatever it is. I'm going to take all my money out of the horrible market that's causing all the pain and do something, give it all to a regenerative farmer in my neighborhood.
Yeah, what you've made me think, and I think what hopefully listeners will think as well, is that they can reclaim their own agency. It's not about shifting the entire system. It's about what's mine to do. What are some small things I can do to bring this economy and service of life to fruition? And I've really got a lot of value from all the work and the research that you've done.
Thank you, Jeni. It's a pleasure. Really appreciate it.